English translation. 607th Contact Monday, the 12th of January 2015, 21:08 hours.
Greetings, dear friend Edward. And why you called me is not a question for me, because I am sure it is about what is happening in Paris.
Greetings to you too, Ptah, dear friend. Of course you're right about your assumption. But it's nice that you're already here today so we can share our thoughts.
I gave you my word I'd come here if you'd call me.
I know, and I thank you for that. Because I want to talk to you about what we discussed on the 3rd of January at our 606th official conversation about malicious and terrorist comedy. Cartoons and satirics which are offensive and murderous in terms of honor, dignity, religion, and also people, and which will have terrible consequences. That happened faster than we thought during our conversation. Although we were sure that it could happen very soon, in the near future, but that it would happen 4 days later. We really did not know that because we did not make any calculations or forecasts in this respect. What we talked about came about simply because I had a need and an urge to do so, and I knew that sooner or later something murderous would happen. And the fact that the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo was hit by the terrorist attack in Paris, of all places, is what happened. By a coincidence, so to speak, without me knowing or even suspecting that it would be this newspaper that would spread Islamophobic cartoons and sayings, and thus embody nothing other than a smear campaign against Islam and Muslims. And when all the actions of this newspaper and the newspaper and cartoon makers are considered and analyzed, then it becomes obvious that this paper is nothing more than a terrorism against Islam, the Muslims, and their Prophet Muhammad. And those responsible can do this without being called to account and punished by law. For to the contrary, they are still granted police protection and cheered on by the ignorant people, who are not able to recognize that every order and the Islamic order are disrupted by the actions of Charlie Hebdo, and inevitably murder attacks are conjured up by Islamists and other terror elements. But I only named this satirical newspaper because it was in my mind because of an evil satire against Muhammad. So I didn't know effectively that this newspaper, or the people there, would be the first target of the impending murder. Because they promote and challenge terrorist activities with their Islamophobic cartoons and sayings, because they themselves carry out racist and terrorist actions. There is only to say that who sows hate and terror will also harvest again hate and terror. I was simply clearly aware that the fundamental, fanatical and radical Islamists would sooner or later go out and murder those who would use dirty cartoons, comedy, and satire to drag the faith and beliefs of Muslims into the mud. And this can also be the case with other religions, believers, and their faith values, when in the same style everything concerning religion, faith, and faith values is insulted and ruined. But in fact, I didn't know anything about what was going to happen, but only had a hunch, just as you had no previous knowledge of what was going to happen, and didn't make a preview of it either.
For my part, although I had no knowledge of the whole thing either, because I did not indeed make any forecasts in this regard, it was, of course, to be expected that something would happen, just as it was to be expected that such terrorist attacks would be carried out and that human lives would be lost. And I didn't think that our words on the 3rd of January would come true so quickly either.
The reactions that followed the attacks in Paris all over the world, there were 2 or even 3 such incidents in only 2 days. If everything is considered correctly, were on the one hand remarkable, but on the other hand also very regrettable, because many of them, who took part in the funeral march in Paris, could certainly live out their ambitions secretly or openly with regard to their hatred of foreigners. Foreigners, Islam, Muslims, and races in this funeral march, which was actually meant to be an expression of mourning for the murdered, and on the other hand, against bloody terrorism. Others, however, quite obviously took part in the funeral march only in order to show themselves publicly and to put themselves in a good light with the populations of their country and in the world public, which particularly refers to special powerful statesmen and other rulers who marched along on the front line with funeral appointments, so that they could be seen and photographed by journalists, in order to then shine on television as compassionate, powerful statesmen, etc. And if I consider the corresponding photos and films in newspapers, etc., as well as on television, which I have watched very closely, then I could see anything but an honest share of mourning in the faces and facial expressions of the state rulers and other rulers, as well as also with various normal funeral march companions from the people. The faces I saw and looked at were often not marked by grief, but rather by fear and hatred. The same picture emerges with regard to the hostility of foreigners. Foreigners, Islam, Muslims, races and religions of the PEGIDA movement in Germany, which is to be brought to life by such haters now also in Switzerland. But the truth is that it is not only about hostility towards foreigners, Islam and Muslims against other races and foreign religions, because in the background of the whole there is an extremist, even terrorist factor hidden. This is aimed at attacking and persecuting not only Islam and the Muslims, but also Judaism and the Jews in the background, without the followers of the PEGIDA movement, who are running and roaring along in the chorus, being able to perceive it. And this does not happen in any way other than in the 1930s, when the mankind criminal Adolf Hitler came to the helm and in the same way gathered the people around him and incited them against the Jews, as the PEGIDA movement does with the Muslims. But how naive, even stupid must these people be who take part in this extreme hate movement and do not notice what is really going on and what the clock has struck, as well as what the founder of the PEGIDA movement, Lutz Bachmann, is really up to. The question is whether all those Germans who participate in the PEGIDA movement and shout for its aims have not learned anything from the last World War, when the genocide of the Jews took place, when Adolf Hitler and his butchers murdered millions of Jews and generally more than 60 million people. The PEGIDA founder had other idea founders in the background, as the following internet excerpt says.
Meanwhile, the news magazine Der Spiegel, in its latest issue from Saturday, has dealt with some of the 10 PEGIDA founders from Dresden, from the failed CDU city council to a former operator of a hammam. But also, the security employee Siegfried de Britz belongs to the early idea givers of PEGIDA. On Facebook, the 39-year-old posted quotes from Adolf Hitler and insulted Muslims. About the Kurds fighting against the terror of the Islamic State, IS, he wrote, "They are a great danger for the civilized Europe and Germany, like all other currents within the Mohammedans." Another PEGIDA activist is Meisen's former CDU city councilor, Thomas Thallacher. His acquaintances told the Spiegel he was not very stable in his view of the world and easy to seduce, but he is a neo-Nazi. Name dispute. Thallacher was already rushing against asylum seekers on Facebook in the summer of 2013. What do we want with the 90% uneducated pack that only Hearts 4 collects here and bleeds out our welfare state? Thallacher posted at the time. After a stabbing he suspected. Certainly another Ramadan Turk whose development was disturbed or half-starved. The party finally asked him to resign as a city councilor. As discussions on Facebook show, members initially disagreed about the name. Originally, PEGIDA was supposed to be called Peaceful Europeans, against the Islamization of the West, writes Der Spiegel. But that was too lax for many. I find the name far too nice and good-hearted fraction compatible. Do we need this? Why do we have to go in peacefully? Europeans? I am German national is the word, was one of the comments. And on the internet, you can also find the following. The patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident, PEGIDA, called for rallies in several German cities today. Monday, too, this time with mourning ribbon because of the attack on the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. Federal Justice Minister Heiko Maas finds this hypocritical. In Dresden, people with a black ribbon on their arms want to commemorate those very victims in Paris, who just a week ago called them a lie press. On Sunday, he asked the organizers to cancel the demonstrations. The victims do not deserve to be abused by such agitators. Great danger to civilized Europe, Germany. This actually says everything that had to be said in a short way. But if I think further, then there is one more word to mention, that the PEGIDA movement has nothing to do with a free expression of opinion, which is supposed to be represented. And it also has nothing to do with the striving for free and true democracy, because in fact the PEGIDA movement is hostile to foreigners, and foreigners as well as Islam and Muslims, as can be seen in the following short internet article. Above all, the face of PEGIDA patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West is concerned with German asylum policy, which he does not like. We are for the admission of war refugees, but against the admission of economic refugees, he says in almost every one of his speeches, and reaps rejoicing and applause for it. We also stand for the fact that every minority, no matter where they come from, if they live, work, and want to eat with us, speaks German and should respect our laws and culture. And he adds, we demand stricter entry controls and stronger deportations, also within Europe. Words with which he goes on catching souls, and like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, more and more people run to him or to his words. So, if everything is considered carefully, then it is primarily a question of hostility and hatred against Islam and Muslims, which also emerges from the Islamization of the West. So the PEGIDA attacks, insults and hates the Muslims and their faith as well as their religion, Islam, hypocritically stating the murderous, fanatical, radical, and fundamentalist machinations of the Islamists. But these have truly nothing to do with the true and righteous Muslims, who also want nothing to do with the Islamist murderers and criminals. No matter whether they belong to the IS militia terrorists, Al-Qaeda murderers, or other terror murderer networks, or are individual extremists with regard to terrorism. And as far as PEGIDA continues to be concerned, any reasonable person can imagine that this movement in the background is working towards casting a spell over the entire German people, and recently, if possible, the Swiss population as well. If the authorities, security forces, secret services, etc., do not get their act together properly, then there will be a new evil in Europe that will be far worse than the effects of the EU dictatorship. Those responsible in Germany and Switzerland should think about it thoroughly and take the right action to prevent the catastrophe. If this does not happen, then a Muslim persecution, and very probably also again a Jewish persecution, grows by the anti-Semitic agitation tirades of the PEGIDA. And it makes me wonder what you think of that, Ta?
I can only agree with everything you have said and copied from the internet.
In addition to everything we have talked about now, I still receive some articles, which I also let you read and which I actually also wanted to have in this conversation report, but unfortunately, these are not yet finished or on the way and therefore not yet arrived with me.
If you receive them by Thursday, as I will come here to correct them, then I can and want to read them. You can then add them to today's conversation report at the end.
Well, then we're agreed on that too. Something else. In our last conversation, I forgot to ask how large the population of Earth was on the 31st of December 2014.
At 0 o'clock on 31.12. 2014, Earth's population was 8,532,048,007 people.
On Monday, I answered a letter question which I formulated as follows. Are the external shape and color of the jet ships 100% determined in terms of use, and do they not have to satisfy any aesthetic requirements? I have written the following to the questioner according to what I know from your explanations. Now to your question concerning the outer also inner forms and colors of the Pleiar and beam ships, which I can answer with the fact that they have no aesthetic background, because they are purely useful in every respect. The following may serve as an example. Some jet ships have a kind of metallic, wide-colored and slightly wavy ring band at their outermost rounding, some also on the surfaces, which produces a change of color depending on the type and density of atmosphere. Also, the windows are of the same kind, because also these consist of a very hard metal, which is transparent on the one hand like glass. On the other hand, however, also according to the kind and density of the atmosphere, the color changes. In our earthly atmosphere and near the ground, we get a red color of the windows, but if we look from the inside to the outside, we get a yellowish-green effect. As I was told, these colors determine the protection of the outer beamship material, which in any case consists of a special, very hard and resistant alloy. The colors thus have an effective protective effect that spreads over the ship and the windows and repels any foreign bodies that may appear in the atmosphere of a planet and hit the beam ship. The colors also indicate the state of the atmosphere, etc., as I was told. So colors and shapes are purely useful.
Your remarks are so far correct, if not exact and detailed, then nevertheless according to the facts.
I do not want to go into such questions in detail and in depth, because I do not know to what extent I am allowed to make statements in these matters.
Which you're doing right. What is not correct and objectionable, however, relates to the fact that, although we have prohibited it, translations into the poor English language are nevertheless made by the core group members with regard to orders, etc., as well as textbooks and articles. In the future, this is to be stopped once and for all and no longer disregarded. It is very regrettable that such violations have occurred despite our order that such translations should no longer be carried out. The flaws and inadequacy of the English language in relation to the German language is so catastrophic that we cannot continue to tolerate translations of this kind. Too many mistakes, misunderstandings, inaccuracies and inadequacies occur in English translations, because the English language is so poor in terms that it is impossible to translate the values of the terms, synonyms and words, etc., as they exist in the German language, correctly and comprehensibly into the very poorly expressed and inadequate English language.
It is unfortunate that your instructions were violated, but this was probably due to a misunderstanding or carelessness in listening at the general meeting when I presented and explained your instructions. For my part, however, I followed the instructions you gave me.
It may be that a misunderstanding or inattention has been at the root of the misconduct, but both non-observance and inattention cannot be used as excuses.
I can accept that. But what about the fact that national groups, etc., are allowed to carry out general translations in other countries, and even in foreign language countries? Is this still the case?
This shall remain so, but the national groups and translation persons concerned shall bear full responsibility for all translation errors, deficiencies, misunderstandings, inaccuracies, and inadequacies, etc. And this applies not only to translations into English, but into all languages in general.
But the correspondence can remain in English and all other possible languages, right? That's what you said back then.
This is correct, because for correspondence purposes this must of course be permitted, unless it is impossible to discuss translatable intellectual teachings.
Clear and understood. Then I still have something to discuss with you, which must remain a private matter, because it is about... But thank you, because that helps me again, because now I know where I am and what I have to think about it. Very regrettable, but just...
Then I want to go now because I still have some things to do that cannot be postponed. Goodbye, dear friend. You really don't have an easy life with a lot of things.
That's the way it is, but you have to bite the bullet, whether you like it or not. Goodbye, Ptah.
Satire as an instrument of power, provocation and destruction. Attack on satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo on the 7th of January, 2015.
Charlie Hebdo is a French satirical magazine. In a terrorist attack on the editorial office in Paris, on the 7th of January 2015, 12 people were murdered, including 4 prominent cartoonists from the editorial team of the magazine, including the editor and 4 illustrators. The perpetrators escaped and took hostages. On the 9th of January 2015, the French police ended the hostage-taking using force, killing the 2 assassins. At the same time, special units stopped taking hostages in a Jewish supermarket in eastern Paris and killed the perpetrator who had previously murdered his 4 hostages. To this, it must be said that any kind of terrorism terror Latin fear. Terror, for whatever reasons and by whatever means it is committed and carried out, is inhumane, scurrilous, cowardly and despicable, because it is in no way compatible with any creational laws and recommendations. People who commit terrorist acts, although terror can also be carried out purely psychologically, for example through harassment and provocation, are usually driven by hatred, revenge, envy, jealousy and other base motives, are driven madly by these, and ultimately lose control of themselves, degenerating into beasts in the form of human beings who can easily fall into a bloodlust of unrestrained, senseless murder, rape, torture, etc. Unfortunately, the vast majority of all terrorist acts can be attributed to religious convictions and the resulting ill delusions, as in the case of the terrorist organizations Islamist State and Islamist State. IS and Al-Qaeda, whose leaders are filled with obviously incurable delusions, hatred, murder and revenge, through which they have turned themselves into bestial creatures, deprived of all humanity and capable of all conceivable cruelties, crimes and bestialities. They have neither a rest of conscience nor a breath of compassion in them, and are totally dominated by their self-inflicted delusional disease. Such people, who are called men only by name, but who are in reality worse than any brutish and bloodthirsty cattle, must be secured by all necessary means, and separated by sex, separated from society for life. So if, depending on the situation, nothing else remains to be done, they must be eliminated in this way so that they never again find access to human society, because only in this way can all dignified and honorable lives be protected. Terrorism of all kinds is and remains despicable, deeply cruel and inhumane, and must be punished severely. The creational natural laws and recommendations make it clear that body and life, the psyche and the physical integrity of the fallible must never be touched. Only the fulfillment of measures may be taken in such a way that these criminals are segregated for all time by the honorable society, without any prospect of return. The repeated cries in such cases after the introduction or reintroduction of the death penalty only testify to the cowardly vindictiveness, hatred, and inhuman perfidy of those people who cry out for the death penalty, because in reality, they are no better off than the terrorists, murderers and criminals themselves, who want to catapult them out of life vengefully and bloodthirsty. At the first moment of horror after such a terrorist attack, it is all too easy to show solidarity with the victims of the attack on Charlie Hebdo, in an act of apparent humanity, and out of an apparently morally legitimate solidarity, and thus to oppose the radicalization of society externally. It would be far more honest, intelligent, and far-sighted to think openly and critically about the causes of such attacks and the rapidly increasing number of such terrorist acts, as well as about the actual reasons for the emergence of the IS, of Al-Qaeda, and of all other terrorist organizations and criminal gangs. It is clear that the assassins and murderers of Paris did not carry out their attacks and hostage-takings without reason. From a subjective point of view, the recurring denigration of the Prophet Muhammad by the caricaturists of the magazine Charlie Hebdo over the years was the trigger for their terrorist acts. For reasons of reason, and out of respect for the religious feelings of the faithful, freedom of expression should always be exercised in every form, in spite of all legally secured freedom of opinion, in such a way that the honor and dignity of any living or already deceased person is in no way denigrated, slandered, mocked, or dragged into the mud, as is clearly the case with the sometimes extremely tasteless Muhammad cartoons. For example, the Prophet Muhammad was exposed in the following scenarios. Muhammad is cover boy of Charlie Hebdo, a special edition of Charlie Hebdo, with the saying, 100 lashes to anyone who doesn't die of laughter. Muhammad 2012 with hanging testicles and naked butt with a yellow star in it. Muhammad 2013 in a wheelchair pushed by a rabbi. Muhammad 2014 beheaded by an IS fighter. No one would find such actions or such representations humorous in their personal environment if, for example, a living or deceased family member were denigrated and degraded. Freedom of the press, like freedom of expression in general, is a valuable asset worth protecting. But it must not be a license for bad insults, defamations, and shameful acts that grossly and inexcusably violate the personal thoughts and feelings, as well as the honor and dignity of human beings. This is where all people, including press representatives and cartoonists, need common sense, reason, and common sense, if there is one. Senseless provocations, humiliations, and insults in the form of words and pictures do not exactly testify to the all too high intelligence of the authors and supporters of such works of art. Also the production and spreading of humiliating writings, pictures, and caricatures corresponds in truth to a terror based on claims to power against dissenters, as long as they are not to blame for anything. Charlie Hebdo's leaders, and all those acting in the same way, expose their personnel, other people, and the police to assassination and terrorist attacks, and also squander taxpayers' money. In Denmark, this was apparently understood, and it stopped bringing such defamatory cartoons to the public. Also, satire in this style has nothing to do with freedom. Freedom is in truth a matter of consciousness, and does not consist of spreading foul slander and falsehoods. In view of the currently very dangerous world situation, each individual human being must be aware of his responsibility and should not pour oil on the fire. When in many places the fanatical embers of religiously conditioned delusions, with all the inhuman degenerations that may possibly result from them, and a war that destroys everything glows. If it's about blasphemy, if it's about abuse, or if it's simply about belittling someone just for the sake of belittling, then a limit has been reached. Gisela Vetter-Liebenau, director of the Deutsches Museum für Karikatur und Zeichenkunst, told Westdeutscher Rundfunk. According to Oliver Schalappert, speaker of the German Press Council, it is important that behind satire, and in particular caricature, that is to say, the pictorial form of satire, there is always a statement. As long as there is a political or social core message behind satire, and as long as no one is ridiculed or a religion is made ridiculous, satire moves in the area of what we consider acceptable. For clarification, contrary to the speculations of some scientists, Muhammad actually lived and was a true prophet. Excerpt from the book Kelch der Wahrheit. Introduction, page 3, on the origin of the first 14 chapters of the book. This is Nocodemian's original and billion-year-old teaching, which was taught and disseminated on this planet Earth by his 6 subsequent professors. From Enoch to Muhammad in various unadulterated interpretations and according to the understanding of their respective epochs. In particular, they were the prophets listed below. 1. Enoch the 3rd of February, 9308 BC, to the 1st of January, 8942 BC. 2. Elijah the 5th of February, 891 BC, to the 4th of June, 780 BC. 3. Josiah the 7th of February, 772 BC, to the 5th of May, 690 BC. 4. Jeremiah the 9th of February, 662 BC to the 3rd of September, 580 BC. 5. Emmanuel the 3rd of February, 02 BC to the 9th of May, 111 AD. And 6. Muhammad the 19th of February, 571 AD to the 8th of June, 632 AD. The 6 announcers of the spiritual doctrine mentioned were in direct succession and prophetic line to each other, and thus in constant rebirth of the spiritual form. Each one of them had the important task of proclaiming the original teachings of Nocodemian to Earth humans in their respective epochs of time and life, and to leave them to posterity to the best of their ability. Excerpt from the Figu Special Bulletin, number 69 of October 2012. If now, specifically, the speech of Muhammad is to be said, then it is to be said clearly and unambiguously that he was an absolutely honorable and irreproachable man, to whom all dignity was due as a man and prophet, and also in the present time as well as in the future posthumously is due. He was a man who never let himself be guilty of anything unworthy of a human being, but who was accused of the opposite by irresponsible and greasy elements. If he is denigrated by malicious people, liars and slanderers, etc., with lies and slander, then this corresponds to an unparalleled blasphemy, because Muhammad has never done anything in any way that would have violated the creational natural laws and recommendations. He was a quite respectable man, to whom in his time really all honor was appropriate, and also today, so long after his death, continues to be entitled. Also for all future, as is also the case for all other true prophets of the Nocodemian line. But this display of honor and dignity has nothing to do with glorification, because the whole thing is based solely on the fact that justice and reality and their truth are satisfied and taken into account, and that the effective facts are named. If the Prophet Muhammad is maliciously slandered by Christian believers and sectarians, by any antagonists, and even by the main church, by so-called free churches or secular thinkers, etc., then this corresponds to mean groundless and scandalous insults, abuses and honors, blasphemous desecrations, defilements and mockeries of the person and the name, which could not be worse. People who do this do not deserve to be called human beings, for they are degenerate and morally depraved, unjust creatures whose slander should be severely punished by law. Such insults, as well as slander of any kind, have nothing to do with a free expression of opinion, which should be guaranteed by our human rights, even if the lies and blasphemies relate to those who have long since died, who can no longer comment on the slander and blasphemy directed against them, as is also the case with Muhammad. who is repeatedly denigrated and slanderously blasphemed by the Christian world, at least by certain autocratic mad Christians or by lunatics of other faiths. Unfortunately, this happens again and again, which consequently causes many believers in Islam to rage, who then cry out for murder, manslaughter, and destruction, which is of course just as reprehensible as that which the slanderers, who are usually haters of race and foreigners, as well as enemies of foreign religions and opinions, bring into the world and spread either through radio, television, newspapers, journals, inflammatory writings, through group-related or public inflammatory speeches, as well as through the internet. The West, with its predominantly Christian way of thinking and acting, should reflect on what the cult and religion of Christ has done in the course of the last 2 millennia. Christianity in particular has exploited, tortured, and bestially murdered more people in the last 2,000 years than it has killed together in the last 2 world wars. It is time to distance oneself from a doctrine that still practices the Inquisition in the form of oppression of women, homosexuals, and other believers, demonizes every form of contraception, and condemns sexuality as dirty, abuses children under protective orders, even in the form of religious preachers and representatives, and mocks and laughs at their victims behind closed doors and under the guise of alleged charity. The aim of the religious powers is to keep the individual dependent, to make him stupid, to deprive him of his natural self-responsibility, to exploit him, and to keep him in conscious bondage in the name of an imaginary God. According to official figures, millions of people were victims of the Catholic Inquisition. It is estimated that up to 10 million people were killed, tortured, abused, and terrorized. News magazine Spiegel 1.6. 1998. One also thinks of the so-called Hexenhammer Lat. Malleus Maleficarum, a work for the legitimation of the witch persecution, which the Dominican Heinrich Kramer lettered. Henricus Institutaris, published in 1486 in Speyer, according to today's state of research, and which appeared until the 17th century, in 29 editions. It is regarded as one of the most devastating books of world literature and has brought death to thousands of people. Since its first edition in 1487, the book has been a powerful instrument for the inquisitors. It legitimizes the persecutions of witches by the Pope and serves as a guide for the conviction and conviction of alleged witches. On the 11th of January 2015, millions of people around the world took part in funeral marches to commemorate the victims of the Paris attacks following the attack on the Charlie Hebdo editorial office. Throughout France, more than 3.7 million people took to the streets for the 17 deaths. In Paris alone, up to 1.6 million people gathered, the highest number since the end of the Second World War. And on the 11th of January 2015 at 15:25, the heads of state set themselves in motion for the Republican March. The heads of state Angela Merkel, Germany, François Hollande, France, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel, Matteo Renzi, Italy, and also the Swiss President Simonetta Sommaruga held on and walked together through Paris. But it turned out that they all did not carry out their funeral march with the masses, but on a separate side street. When one considers that the European heads of state allied themselves with the war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, one can only identify this action as extremely hypocritical, addicted to profiling, and as a mockery of the values of true humanity. Apparently, not all of the participating heads of state and government, in their irresponsible naivety and criminal stupidity, are aware that unconditional solidarity with the victims of the assassination attempt is tantamount to blanket, approval and justification of the shameless cartoons that the terrorists have used as the occasion for their murder actions, which are as cowardly as they are criminal. Such large-scale fraternization and hypocrisy spectacles are nothing more than power political propaganda actions by the powerful. State leaders and all the ordinary people who participate in them, who want to put themselves in the right light in the name of a supposed sympathy and in the common fight against terror. Many of these powerful statesmen are themselves the worst criminals or have contributed through their own help, and crawl towards other warmongers, see Merkel and G.W. Bush, themselves to the fact that the competition between Christianity and Islam in the meantime threatens to escalate to a struggle or a war of religions. Instead of such senseless and expensive mass gatherings, such rulers should at last exercise neutrality and restraint in themselves, and finally put an end to their irrational activities of constant interference in the affairs of others. To return to the question in the title, whether satire can be an instrument of power, provocation and destruction. Yes, satire is an instrument of power, provocation and destruction when it leads to terrorist attacks and, as a consequence, to total surveillance of humanity. The powerful justify the total surveillance of the people with the fear of terror and as a no alternative instrument to bring peace. In truth, the whole thing leads more and more into the bondage and enslavement of the people, because the powerful, like unscrupulous jackals, make terror usable for their shameful purposes. The welfare of the people, peace, real freedom, harmony among people and true love are of no interest to them, because they are deeply selfish and blinded by their ill-power mania. It makes sense to anyone who can even think a little bit ahead that the insane terrorists will not be impressed by the marches of the people, and that all this brainless action can degenerate into an undreamt of butchery for which no healthy thinking person wants to be jointly responsible. Achim Wolf, Germany.
Far from reality.
The extremely terrible and deeply shocking event in Paris in which 12 people were brutally mown over on the 7th of January 2015 has since occupied the whole world. Europe has stood up, moved together, and raised its voice in deep lamentation and brave resistance, apparently. But if you take a closer look at the pictures and the reactions, it's easy to see that suffering, sadness, and compassion are not real in most people and are just a show of compassion that arises from the horror and panic that it might hit you. If we get to the bottom of the matter, then it turns out that the attack on the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo was challenged completely consciously, recklessly, frivolously, and in arrogant stupidity, not to mention by the victims themselves, who also immediately took innocent people with them in a Jewish supermarket, which was also immediately afterwards assassinated by an Islamist. What now threatens to be swept under the table is the fact that the paper, about whose quality there will also be a word to be said, was already attacked 3 years ago by an arson attack from the Islamist side, which is why it was then, completely mistakenly, given police protection. The reason for the attack at that time was not freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but their ruthless and arrogant abuse and the presumptuous attitude that a satirical magazine should allow itself anything and that no rules of decency, humanity, or consideration apply to such a thing. This track was continued with impertinence, and no thought was wasted on the fact that one was faced with a far superior, deeply fanatical, unteachable, and fast-growing overpowering opponent, namely with the radical Islamist terrorism, which in no way has anything to do with or can even remotely be compared with Islam, which is neither radical nor fanatical or bloodthirsty. In this absolute misjudgment and negation of reality, which quite obviously was not even remotely recognized and would not have been accepted, because self-righteousness, arrogance, unneeded impertinence, and boundless irresponsibility swung the scepter. One did not govern rationally, deliberately, and responsibly, but just as fanatically, stupidly, and unteachably as the Islamists themselves. Of course, one can accuse the Islamists of a lower attitude, but the attitude of those responsible for Charlie Hebdo is much worse in my eyes. Because instead of taking reality for a ride, which provides enough material for satirical arguments, a religion harmless in itself and its prophet were slandered, ridiculed and put down, and the faithful as well as its revered prophet were showered with every imaginable filth, and one of the great religions of this world was not only placed on the pillory of ridicule, but also disqualified as hostile scum. To what extent one can speak of education and culture in such an attitude and behavior remains open at this point. The reactions of Muslims are of an absolutely different quality than the stupid aggressiveness of the so-called satirical magazine, which for its part transfers the term satire from Latin satira, derived from saturalanx = bowl filled with fruits. In the figurative sense, all sorts of colorful mixtures from ridicule or mockery into the terms cut off of honor and mockery, which have nothing to do with it. Thus, Charlie Hebdo not only pollutes and disqualifies himself, but a whole genre, which in turn usually knows exactly what belongs and what does not, and how real satire should be. This shows that this shameful newspaper should neither be defended nor supported, but should be banned because of its lack of quality, the absolute lack of any legal awareness, and the shameful abuse of freedom of speech and press, because its leaders, who were imprisoned because of the violation of human rights, which include freedom of religion as inviolable, do nothing but spray dangerous and deadly poison, to which innumerable innocent, uninvolved people can still fall victim. This time, it has hit in overwhelming numbers the culprits who have provoked and caused the disaster themselves through their arrogant behavior, their recklessness and stupidity. Censorship in the form of a total ban on publication would be appropriate and desirable here, in order to protect French society and the entire European population. In contrast to the childishly defiant, disrespectful and querulous behavior of those responsible for Charlie Hebdo, who, in their kind of unteachable fanaticism, are messing with the no less fanatical and unteachable Islamists, and thus threaten to plunge not only France into a hell of insecurity and terrorism, Muslims remain relatively calm and thoughtful about all the filth with which they and their prophet are inundated, apart from a few justified demonstrations. There has been no more serious reaction since the vicious attacks escalated, like adults who shake their heads and patiently watch a disenchanted child get over it. This way of reacting clearly shows the difference between Islamists and Muslims, between whom strict and careful distinction must be made. The Islamists are fanatical, radical sects and associations, which should not be accepted and tolerated under any circumstances, but which can be fought by other means than misguided ridicule, cut off of honor and mockery, by which also the peace-loving and peaceful, tolerant Muslims. While such behavior is considered by the Islamists to be an attack and a revelation of an unteachable, devilishly apostate attitude which can only be destroyed by violence and destruction because it is recognized as not being aligned. But the paper's so-called ruthless satire proves that they are in no way inferior to Islamists in their radicalism, fanaticism, and lack of any consideration, as well as in any legal consciousness and in the deepest inhumanity, and are absolutely equal to them, or even in the same direction. The Islam to which Muslims belong is fundamentally far more tolerant, generous, considerate, humane, and peace-loving than Christianity ever was. Think of the Inquisition and the Crusaders, which in its unteachable persuasive quality and arrogant posturing is closer to evil Islamist terrorism than Islam and Muslims. Still, the word of a friend sounds to me in the ears, who said, "First Catholic or Christian, then evil, and who drove with it the nail with a blow through the board?" After the murders and the fact that the perpetrators had been put to death by the French police and ripped, no less brutally and ruthlessly, like the partly innocent victims themselves the following Sunday, 11.1. 2015, the commemoration of the unfortunate victims took place in demonstrations and mass marches. Looking at the faces of the people who took part in these funeral marches, It is easy to see that most of them felt neither honest sympathy nor compassion, but sheer indifference and silent relief that it had been others and not themselves who had been affected. In spite of everything, they were not aware of the dangerous signal that was actually sent out by such a mass march. Because for the radicalized and fanatical Islamists, such a march is not a demonstration of strength and resistance, but an invitation to finally bring a bloody end to the devilish and blasphemous activities in Europe. Dishonesty, stupidity, ignorance, irresponsibility, and irrationality, as well as complete lack of reality wherever one looks in this catastrophic tragedy, in this disaster. It fits wonderfully, like a fist on the eye, that the apparently marching along dozens of state leaders who want to have taken part in the front line and led the masses, by which they allegedly showed their solidarity. Above all, the unspeakable Angela Merkel were not really there, as the press wanted to make believe the gullible and stupid people. The pictures proved that the politicians and statesmen had closed themselves up, arm in arm, set up in a lonely side street and let themselves be photographed, far away from the funeral march, which they did not even see, and of which they were never a part, so as not to endanger their precious lives. Immediately after the shots, which were all taken, they got back into their state cars and were driven away. Only French President François Hollande and French Prime Minister Manuel Valls joined the survivors of the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and a Jewish supermarket for a short time after the misleading photo opportunity, probably because they had no other choice. Nothing, but also nothing at all in this disaster is real or only close to reality, except for the dead, who had to die a terribly avoidable, sad death, because the facts were ignored, misjudged, and never searched for, and therefore not found from the very beginning without any responsibility or reason. The price for the imagination and ignorance, which were shown towards the facts and thus towards the truth, is immensely high, but all in all also just because to slap the truth in the face and to disregard it never remains without evil consequences. And as world history currently presents itself, dominated by egoism, false models, delusion of power, and abstruse ideas, we will still have to endure many similar catastrophes. If man is not prepared to face the facts and the truth and to act reasonably and responsibly according to the requirements, but prefers to think that the universe must turn according to his imagination, then he should not be surprised if no peace, freedom, equality, unity, understanding, and harmony are achieved, but his world and his societies are shaken by hostility, hatred, murder, suffering, need, and misery. This is the deeper message and reality that can be gleaned from the attacks in Paris in January 2015. Bernadette Brand, Switzerland.